Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in 1 minute. I'm waiting for people to log in. We have almost 100 people registered for today. And so we're just taking a minute to let people register. In the meantime, some people might notice we have 2 boxes marked as ASL interpreters, American Sign Language interpreters. So they will be with us throughout the event and part of the recording for tonight, if anyone wants to start to look for those panels. Thank you for joining us this evening on Zoom for our 2021 Global Dialogue Just Transition and Recovery for Colorado. This event will be live tweeted, so feel welcome to follow along the Inside the Greenhouse handle, which Presley is putting into the chat. Your questions also may be typed into chat. We'll turn to them after all the speakers have had a chance to address us. And we are also recording this event so we can provide closed captioning. And as I mentioned previously, we have 2 American Sign Language interpreters. If you look for ASL interpreter, you will see those boxes to make our conversation more accessible for all.
Hello.
Hi, Max, I'm going to have you introduce our speaker.
Thanks so much, Phaedra, and welcome everyone, and welcome Governor Polis. We know that your time is limited, and so it's my honor to introduce you, but I'm going to keep it short, and so it'll be a short honor. Governor Polis is going to kick things off just to set the stage for our panel and discussion to follow about just transition and recovery in our state. If you don't know already, Governor Polis is an entrepreneur, an education leader, and a public servant. Before becoming our governor in January 2019, he served as the U.S. representative for the 2nd Congressional District here in Colorado for 5 terms, among many other endeavors and accomplishments. So I will turn the floor to you, Governor Polis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, hey, thank you, Max, and thank you, Phaedra, for the kind introduction. Also, thank you to co-directors and student interns, Presley Church and Andrew Beam. 300 students who are promoting climate action events like this one. And I want to thank all of you for their activism. We're also joined by Will TOOR, who we actually stole from his involvement at CU to run the energy office for the whole state. And he's really helping to lead the efforts for a green future for Colorado. You know, really the work that you're doing here at the activism, the work that we try to do every day in my administration is about safeguarding the future of the world, also the future of Colorado. And we're seeing what this hotter, drier future means. Just last year, we had the 3 largest wildfires in the entire history of Colorado in 1 year. 625,000 acres. If you were near it, you experience it here. If you were in Boulder or Denver, you smelt it. And obviously it affected North Boulder area too. And weeks of smoke filled air and difficulty and economic hardship. Look, I ran on a very bold climate agenda of 100% renewable energy by 2040. We're now proud to say that in our first 2 years, we've secured over 99% of the state's electricity on the path to reduce emissions 80% by 2030 in just 9 more years, going to 80% reductions. That leaves another decade for that final 20%. We became the first state in a decade to adopt the zero emission vehicle standards. We implemented historic oil and gas reform legislation. Really one of the hardest things we did, and we got that done in our first year. And we also are working on a very large utility investment in transportation electrification, because when you look at the green grid, you look at electrification of buildings, electrification of vehicles, and of course, we are leading the way in electric vehicles and infrastructure and working on ways to make Colorado an even better place for that. We partnered with Colorado General Assembly, local governments, the private sector, many stakeholders to advance what is truly one of the most bold and comprehensive climate agendas in the entire country. And we recently finalized our state's greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap. When you have time, you can read all, I don't know, 560 pages or so. It's very well done, but it lays out the clear sequencing and actions that we're taking to help meet aggressive climate goals. And we also released the nation's first just transition plan, because as we undergo this transition, we care deeply about the men and women who work in fossil fuels, and how do we make sure that they can be part of this renewable energy future too. Another thing we look at as we pursue this work is a climate equity framework to help make sure that we look at racial equity, that we look at disparate socioeconomic impacts, environmental justice as part of our climate and air quality policy. And developed in close consultation with many stakeholders, our climate equity framework helps guide our community engagement strategy to help make sure that all Coloradans have a say in policies that truly impact our daily lives, and like so many things, often has a greater impact for better or worse on those who are most marginalized and have the most disadvantages already. We prioritize benefits for and help end the pain points for environmental injustices that exist, disproportionately felt by communities of color, low income, indigenous people, communities burdened by air pollution for too long. That's just one of the number of growing initiatives that we're working on to carry environmental justice throughout other policies and programs. We have a tremendous and exciting opportunity with the federal stimulus, right? And we haven't even gotten to see the infrastructure one yet. They haven't even done that one yet. We're just talking about American Rescue Act, CARES Act. We announced a Colorado Recovery Plan of a $700 million legislative package that includes $30 million, I think it might be up to $40 million now, that's allocated to the State Clean Energy Fund. And these are funds that are put in a better position to empower green banking in our state, local control with $2 to $5 million to help local governments with clean energy projects. And now we have the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Act, where Colorado is getting additional money. We're in the middle of a series of listening sessions about that, including one, conservation, renewable energy, environment, animal welfare, and we got to hear a lot of great ideas about that as well. And participants in our environment and clean energy listening session shared a lot of great ideas, ranging from wildfire mitigation, sustainable recreation, wildlife protection, of course, more EV charging stations. We're also working on a state transportation modernization bill that'll be a big boost to EV charging, deeper investment in solar and wind. And these investments will build infrastructure with these one-time funds for a cleaner, greener future for Colorado and for the world. So the importance of students at CU Boulder, and of course, the students from beyond our borders who are joining us today, you are a part of the driving force behind the moral imperative where elders are learning from the young, right? Learning from the young that we must build sustainability into every part of our lives, lay the foundation for environmental justice. Yes, we can. Sí se puede. Your voices matter. Climate science matters. People are listening, and I'm here to encourage you to keep it up. Be even bolder, and know that our team at the Capitol and so many elected officials across our state and country are fighting every day to help make this necessary vision a reality. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it back over to Professor BOYCOFF.
Thank you very much, Governor Polis. And we really appreciate your comments here to kick us off. And I'm actually going to turn it over to colleague Professor Phaedra Pezzullo.
Yes, thank you, Governor Polis, for those inspiring remarks. We really appreciate you listening to frontline voices and experts in higher education, including supporting evidence-based research, both on climate and COVID. We've had a really challenging year, and you know that better than anyone. And we look forward to continuing the dialogue with you on your Build Back Stronger listening tour and beyond. Presley's going to put the link for that website in the chat so people know that the governor has an open door during this period of time of a listening tour. You can join into those Zooms and type in your feedback on that website so that they can hear from a variety of perspectives. I am Professor Phaedra Pezzullo, as Max just said, and we are speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute tribes, sovereign nations that met with our city council today to continue the dialogue about more sustainable coexistence. One of the important things, I think, from an environmental justice perspective is not just that these are the communities that are the frontline communities impacted disproportionately by crises in climate and COVID and so on, but also that these are communities with a lot to teach us about regeneration and about solutions. In the past year, Colorado, as the governor noted, has faced multiple crises: the climate crisis, the global COVID pandemic, deaths and harassment of BIPOC community members nationally, some of the largest wildfires in the state's history, and the largest mass shooting in the city of Boulder's history, which happened just a few blocks from where I'm standing now. So we're grateful for all of you being present on this Zoom and seeking a bolder future. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Apologies, it got a little messy. There we go. So I like to share this slide that was shared with me by the Climate Justice Alliance this past year, to recognize that a lot of us are going through these different moments right now, through all these challenges. Depending on the hour or the minute, we could feel overwhelmed fear, we can feel growth, we can take action, and that's what we're excited about today, and also learning. So just know that we understand that lots of people are in different places, and that's part of why we're recording, so that there's more flexibility for people to participate in lots of different ways, and that we'll be sharing the links in the Inside the Greenhouse website and social media in days to come for those who were unable to join us at this time. I just want to clarify two assumptions and then turn it over to our amazing speakers and my colleague. First, the idea of a just transition came out of the grassroots labor movement and often is attributed to Tony Mazzocchi, who said at the 2000 Green Party Convention in Denver, Colorado in 2000, if there's to be a real alliance around our shared concerns, the cornerstone has to be a just transition, a transformation moving from the type of society that does harm to a great many people to a society that does harm to no one, and a society that's free of want. And this idea since has been embraced and developed by many. Perhaps the most notable framework is by the Climate Justice Coalition, who Presley will put this link also into the chat. And it identifies the many things that we're thinking about, and the speakers tonight will address probably even more, in moving from a dead economy based on fossil fuels and extractive economy to a living economy. And in the state of Colorado, as the governor noted, we are the first state to have a just transition office. The initial focus is coal workers, and we're excited tonight to think and imagine beyond that initial step with our speakers tonight, and that's why we invited these particular people. So thank you for joining us. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and move back to Professor BOYCOFF.
Thanks so much, Phaedra, Professor Pezzullo. I just want to take a moment before I introduce our panelists, just to thank a few and recognize sponsors, supporting organizations, and individuals. So as you may have seen on Phaedra's slides, the Solve Climate by 2030 and Open Society University Network is a larger hub through which we are holding this event. Also co-hosts Inside the Greenhouse, the Creative Climate Communication and Behavior Change Center, C3BC, the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, or CERES, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, Colorado Local Science Engagement Network, and the Media and Climate Change Observatory, and the Just Transition Collaborative, many of which are all here at the University of Colorado Boulder. In terms of people, we're going to hear from Presley Church at the end. Presley has been a wonderful intern with Inside the Greenhouse and many other groups of ours here on campus this year. And she has been leading, along with Andrew Benham, another undergraduate student here at the University of Colorado Boulder, in bringing this event to us all today. Also thank Eben Goodstein, David Blockstein, and Masha Zabara, who are the organizers based at Solve Climate by 2030. And also want to thank briefly Megan and Natalie who are providing the sign language interpretation for us. So before we hear from our speakers, actually Presley's going to play a pre-recorded message going out to all of the participating groups. I think there's over 100 that are beginning today in this Make Climate a Class. So you're going to hear from Eben Goodstein first, and then I'll introduce our speakers.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 US states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eben Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the 2 hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon-neutral economy, while the US rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinars homework for the students and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forward, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
Right. Thank you very much to Eben and colleagues who are coordinating this around the world, as he said. And so we're really pleased to have this opportunity with our panelists to talk about just transition and recovery topics as they pertain to their work here in the state of Colorado. So the plan is that each guest will have 10 minutes to speak about just transition and recovery topics. Then we're going to open up the floor to questions. We ask that you use the question and answer function by typing in your questions. Questions that are typed into the chat actually are not going to be considered, so please get them into the Q&A. So at this time, we're going to start by hearing from our first speaker, Will TOOR. And by way of a short introduction, and I will say that in 2019, Will TOOR joined the Colorado Energy Office, as Governor Polis had mentioned, was pulled here from the University of Colorado, but we're very happy for him, and he's the executive director appointed by the governor. Previously, he was Transportation Program Director at SWEEP, which is the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. He's been a Boulder County Commissioner, Mayor of Boulder, Chair of the Denver Regional Council of Governments, and Director of the University of Colorado Environmental Center. He served on the Air Quality Control Commission and the State Oil and Gas Task Force. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Physics from Carnegie Mellon and a PhD in Physics from the University of Chicago. Thank you so much for joining us, Will, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here this evening. And I'm going to take my time to describe the greenhouse gas roadmap that the state has developed with a focus especially on the pieces that are most relevant to economic recovery. Would it be possible to pull up my PowerPoint, please? Let's see.
I'm trying to pull it up 1 second.
Yeah.
If not, press the icon, pull it up.
If you could, it won't let me change the screen I'm sharing for some reason.
Please bear with us. Thank you so much.
Great. Again, thanks for pulling that up. So, I would say the last couple of years working with the Polis administration on climate and clean energy has definitely been the most exciting work that I've done during my life because there's been so much opportunity to make change. In 2019, the state legislature had a historic legislative session in which about 15 major pieces of clean energy and climate legislation moved forward. In particular, for the first time, the state has legislatively adopted science-based targets for greenhouse gas emissions reduction, 50% reduction by 2030 and 90% reduction by 2050, with a broad grant of authority to our state air commission to develop regulations and rules that would support achieving those goals, as well as direction to state agencies to develop programs and investments and partnerships to reduce GHG emissions. It also set a regulatory pathway for our electric utilities to achieve much faster emissions reductions, as Governor Polis mentioned, an 80% reduction by 2030 from the electric sector, as well as setting up the Office of Just Transition to address a just transition for coal workers who are impacted by that change to electricity generation. The legislation also required, for the first time, really set a framework around climate equity, requiring the state to both develop appropriate outreach to and take into account the views of disproportionately impacted communities as we develop and implement climate policy. Next slide, please. As part of the implementation, the governor asked state agencies to work together to develop a strategic roadmap to actually achieving these emissions targets. As a first step, we conducted an updated greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And what we saw is that there are 4 major sources that account for the bulk of our emissions. Transportation is the largest single source, electricity generation, the oil and gas industry, and buildings account for the bulk of emissions in Colorado. Next slide, please. In order to achieve our target of a 50% reduction by 2030, we see that there are 6 or 7 sort of key arenas to work on over the next decade. First and most important is continuing the transition in the electricity sector, retiring coal and replacing it with wind, solar, and battery storage. We need to achieve deep pollution reductions from the oil and gas industry. We're reducing both methane emissions and the combustion emissions from the upstream and midstream oil and gas industry. We need to make changes in transportation, both addressing multimodal transportation and land use planning, but also a big focus on accelerating that transition to electric cars, trucks, and buses. As we move towards a very clean electricity generation system, we can really magnify those benefits through electrification of transportation. We need to make changes to our buildings, and that means both increasing energy efficiency, but also increasingly moving away from burning gas in things like furnaces and water heaters to the use of high efficiency electric appliances like air and ground source heat pumps and heat pump water heaters to actually be able to move towards zero emission vehicle or buildings over time. And finally, there's multiple opportunities for reducing methane pollution from areas like coal mines, landfills, wastewater treatment plants, and agriculture. Next slide, please. The really big transition that we're in the middle of right now is this transition in the electricity sector. As the governor noted, utilities, there's 6 utilities that are responsible for about 99% of the fossil fuel generation in the state. All of them are now committed to reductions that range from 80% all the way up to 100% full decarbonization over the next decade. And when you look at how they're going to do this, we're looking at more than 7,000 megawatts of new wind, solar, and storage, as well as major transmission investments in Colorado. The vast majority of those investments will be taking place in rural Colorado. So we're talking about Southern Colorado, the Eastern Plains, Northwestern Colorado. In many ways, this will be one of the largest sort of rural economic development investments that we'll have seen in many years. We're talking, many billions of dollars of investment that at the same time will actually be saving ratepayers money, because at the same time that you're making this large investment in renewables, the fact that you will no longer have to pay the maintenance and operating costs of expensive older coal generation will actually save everybody money. So it's really a win-win both for rural economic development and for utility ratepayers. Next, please. The governor noted that as part of the state stimulus plan that is before the legislature right now, we have a clean energy finance package that has $40 million of investment in clean energy finance programs. The bulk of that will be going to the Colorado Clean Energy Fund, which is really a relatively newly created green bank for the state of Colorado that will allow investments that would not be funded by sort of typical financial institutions to be able to go forward. The initial focus of the Colorado Clean Energy Fund will actually be on small businesses in just transition communities. But we think that there's a real opportunity here to grow this into a major force within the state for both clean energy and economic recovery. I would note that as part of the Biden administration's American Jobs Plan, they're proposing more than $30 billion of national investment in the Clean Energy Accelerator, which would essentially be national funding for state green banks. And we think there could be opportunities to really scale this up. Next, please. I would also note that there's a transportation funding proposal before the legislature right now that includes major investment in electrification of transportation. The proposal includes approximately $800 million of investment in 3 new enterprises that will focus on electrifying public transit, fleet electrification incentives, including both trucks and school buses, as well as public fleets, and major investments in electric vehicle charging infrastructure and in electric vehicle equity, with a focus on helping low and moderate income communities retire some of the dirtiest vehicles and replace them with electric vehicles, as well as investments in dramatically scaling up the electric bike pilot proposal or pilot project that the state of Colorado has developed. Next slide, please. And just to wrap up here, would note that there are, I think, enormous opportunities for marrying sort of clean energy and climate action and economic recovery coming out of the Biden administration. The American Jobs Act, the infrastructure plan that was released at a high level last week, in many ways, I would say represents an investment-based approach to climate action. And as structured, it supports domestic manufacturing, it supports unions and high labor standards, and it supports a significant investment in communities that have been underserved and disproportionately impacted. When I look at the opportunities for Colorado that are in there, I think there's opportunities for really significant investments in electric vehicle charging, consumer incentives for EV adoption, investment in energy efficient housing upgrades with a special focus on low-income weatherization, huge opportunities in terms of tax credits for renewables, geothermal, carbon capture projects. There are opportunities for investment in hydrogen and carbon capture demonstration projects with a specific focus on economically distressed communities that I think could give real opportunities for our just transition communities. There's billions of dollars for investment in capping abandoned oil and gas wells, which for a state like Colorado means an opportunity to both reduce emissions and provide job opportunities for workers in the fossil fuel sector as we do this clean energy transition. Major investments in transmission for the electric sector, transmission lines, and there's a whole lot else that's in there. So when I think about the opportunities for a green recovery, I think the American Jobs Act is perhaps the largest opportunity that we've seen in a generation. So very excited for the conversation to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Will, for your great comments to start us off. We are now going to next from Professor Stephanie MALIN. Stephanie MALIN is an environmental sociologist specializing in natural resource sociology, governance, and rural development with a focus on the community aspects of resource extraction and energy production at Colorado State University, or CSU. Her main interests include environmental justice, environmental health, social movements, and the socio-environmental effects of market-based economics. She's also co-founded and co-directs the Center for Environmental Justice at CSU, and she has authored a forthcoming book called Changing It All, Using Environmental Sociology to Build Something Better. And welcome to the stage, Stephanie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for that lovely introduction. I'm honored to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, hopefully. There we go. Very good. And I will try to keep an eye on the time for us. So today, as Professor BOYCOFF said, I'm going to be talking from a perspective of environmental justice and social science, or sociology. So I hoped to bring to the table something that we've already heard quite a bit about, and we'll hear more about from our other speakers, looking at protecting environmental justice in just transitions. I think it's really important for us to understand what we mean by environmental justice. I teach courses on it, and it's pretty interesting to hear what a lot of students think environmental justice is before they take the course versus afterwards. So I just wanted to give us a primer in a phrase that many of you are probably very familiar with, but some of us might not be. So just so that we're on the same page in terms of what this means. And of course, this isn't the definition, but it's a helpful working definition for us. So dimensions of environmental justice include distributive justice, and this is kind of what we all think of, right? Where toxics and hazards, but also the good things like bike paths and public transportation and clean air, where all these things end up, who's exposed to them, who has access to them, right? In the case of the good things in our environment. There's also the procedural justice or procedural equity, and we may not think of that as readily. Who decides how we zone our communities, how we use land, and who has a seat at the table to meaningfully or authentically participate when we make these decisions. Along with this is recognition and restorative justice. So making sure that we are recognizing all species and all kinds of biodiversity, as well as human communities and human needs when we're talking about environmental justice, and working to restore relationships and standing of historically marginalized communities to perhaps be the ones who set up the table or construct the table and invite us in. And of course, the environment's anywhere where we live, work, play, or pray, to use a common phrase from the environmental justice movement. It's not just nature, quote unquote, or wilderness out there, but it also includes the built environment. So as you've heard already today, right, there are a lot of, in terms of just transitions and recovery in Colorado, there's a lot of positive progress. We, as Governor Polis said, right, we have our Office of Just Transition in Colorado. Lizeth and Will, of course, are the experts on this because they serve on that. So I don't want to pretend to know more than they do in any way, but it's important for us to look at Colorado as a leader in institutionalizing some of these efforts. There's also more attention now, as Will just talked about, right, at the federal level to environmental justice. And what we see with some of the policies and appointments going on currently is very encouraging in this direction. We see a growth of labor and environment alliances once again, and hope to have that move in that even more in that direction. And then work, of course, by the Just Transitions Collaborative, our Center for Environmental Justice at CSU, and many, many others, many of whom are supporting this event. So these are just some shots taken from our Just Transition Summit hosted by the Center for Environmental Justice a few years ago, where we brought together practitioners, brought together labor representatives, and folks who work in the arena of energy production, renewables, and environmental justice to talk about what just transitions might look like. Of course, we didn't solve anything, but it's definitely the beginning of some very important conversations. So we were asked today as panelists to have an action item that we wanted to talk about and focus on for our talk. And I really want to encourage us to think about how we might do environmental justice work at every phase of transition from a fossil fuel based economy to more regenerative economies. And what this means is along the lines of that procedural equity or procedural justice component, how do we make sure that we have meaningful involvement of marginalized and affected communities and people? What might it look like to have these groups actually construct the table around which we're making decisions instead of being invited to the table to participate, right? And really paying attention to power. As a sociologist, I focus a lot on power and institutions and intersecting sociological variables. And so we want to really attend to those issues as we talk about the justice in just transitions. And today I'll talk just for a few minutes about what that might look like. We heard a little bit at the beginning in our introduction about what a regenerative economy might look like. And I want to just mention some examples and ideas about what distributive and regenerative community development might look like. So in that respect, I want to bring in the ideas of an Oxford economist who I think is using some environmental sociology here as well, and this idea of donut economics. And it's called donut economics because that green space right there that we can see in the middle is identified as the safe and just space for humanity, in this way of looking at how we might transition from a fossil fuel based and neoliberal capitalist economy to different systems. And what we see here is that there's an ecological ceiling and a social foundation when we're talking about what that just and safe space looks like. The ecological ceiling, we don't want to overshoot things like climate change, of course, which is very important to our discussion today, but also things like ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, land conversion, and other concerns. As a sociologist, right, we're also focusing on the social foundation. We don't want to go into shortfall when it comes to things like food access, water access, health, but also things like political voice, social equity, gender equality, and things like that. Unfortunately, as we know, right, we're already an overshoot in several of those categories and shortfall in most of the social categories, especially if we take an international perspective. And today, of course, we're concerned with predominantly climate change, but all of the things that climate crisis impacts, including land conversion and biodiversity loss and some of these other areas where we are in overshoot. So what might a system that is more distributive and regenerative look like, right? What does this mean? What does living in the just and safe space for humanity actually recognize and do? Well, it means recognizing that the economy includes not just markets, right? And we've talked a lot about market-based solutions as a society, especially given our really market-based focus in the US and other nations especially since the 1980s. But we need to recognize that the economy includes households, the commons, the state, and the market, right? The market is just one component of a whole system. The focus on GDP and endless growth is really an impossible goal or an impossible set of goals. So how do we reorient ourselves to goals that are different? How do we, in other words, re-embed the economy, not only in the social world in which it exists, right, but also in the planetary boundaries that are so important? Instead of pretending we have infinite resources, how do we re-embed in a system that recognizes the sacredness and the importance of the resources that we draw on in our economy and in these other components of our daily lives? How do we build distributive and not divisive, as well as regenerative or not degenerative systems? And the beautiful thing about donut economics is that it's malleable and it's applicable at multiple levels. For example, Amsterdam has been building a donut economic system, especially since COVID-19 impacted their economies along with every other economy, right? So we've got many examples at multiple levels where this is being done. I'm going to leave us with a visual aid for thinking about this, right? Because talking about re-embedding the economy has been going on for decades. Karl Polanyi, an economic historian, was one of the first Western theorists to talk about this, but we see examples of this going back much, much further, especially when we look at some of the communities that have been the most marginalized. We see patterns of this well before Karl Polanyi or any of us brought this up. So this idea of looking at a people-centered set of social institutions and systems where households, markets, states, and the commons are part of what we think of as an economy. And of course, that being embedded within a society that is dependent upon the biophysical environment, right? And the energy inputs that are so important for our daily lives. So I will go ahead and leave it there. I'm happy to answer questions at the end, or I wanted to share my email with you so that you can feel free to reach out. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Stephanie. Next we get to hear from Lizeth CHACON. As by way of a short introduction, in the fall of 2014, Lizeth became Executive Director of Rights for All People, and in 2015, she led the Union of Rights for All People in Colorado Progressive Coalition to create the Colorado People's Alliance, or COPA. In 2016, Lizeth co-chaired the statewide ballot measure that successfully increased Colorado's minimum wage to $12 an hour by 2020, and she co-created the statewide Immigrant Resistance Table. Lizeth continues to lead collaborative efforts on climate, economic, immigrant, and racial justice issues. She is the founding executive director of Colorado People's Alliance, or COPA, and is currently on the board of directors of People's Action, among many other things. So thank you so much for joining us, Lizeth, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Buenas tardes a todos. I'm gonna attempt here to share my screen. Hopefully we can make it work. Can folks see that okay?
Looks great.
Thank you so much. Great. So thank you for having me. So again, my name is Lizeth CHACON. I'm the Executive Director of Colorado People's Alliance. I feel like I'm going to bring the really different perspective today on the conversation, like the grassroots community, nonprofit perspective into the work, which is great. And so as a way of story sharing a little bit, I always like to share a little bit more about myself, because we believe that our story is the most important tool that our community has in order to like advocate and really move to create change. So I was born and raised in Mexico. I moved to this country when I was 12 years old. When I first moved here, I saw the injustices that many in our community face. I was called wetback. I was pushed south because I needed to go back to where I belonged. And I also saw my parents struggle. My dad has worked at a meatpacking plant for almost 22 years. He should have retired already, but he can't afford to retire. My mom got really sick when I was in high school. We had to take her to the emergency room. I saw her sign a waiver to release herself from the hospital. And then later I saw her working multiple jobs to pay the huge bill that she got from the emergency room visit. And so I share that because I believe that what drives our community to do is that in one way or another, we're all impacted by the work that we're doing. And so it's really important for us to share our stories and really use our stories as our voice and our tool to really create change so we can have different outcomes. And so who is Colorado People's Alliance? Colorado People's Alliance started back in 2015, and we really started with the desire to build power with communities, to do work with the folks who are directly impacted by the issues and really transform Colorado, both our economy, our climate, immigration systems, and everything else by center communities that are most directly impacted. So we do all of our work through a racial justice lens. That means that we, believe that systemic oppression is the root cause of all of our issues. And so we need to address that in order for us to win on anything else. We also have a member-led model because we believe that those who are closest to the pain are closest to the solution. And we work, we're also a multi-issue organization. So we bring a really unique perspective into the work. So we work on climate, but we also work on economic justice issues and immigrant justice issues as well. On our climate work, and I'm going to mention all these other campaigns because when we think about just transition, it's not just like this big policy that needs to pass at the state legislature or in Congress, right? That moves us to 100% renewable energy by a certain day. There's other things that we could be addressing right now, and it's specifically focusing on people who are most directly impacted. And so for us as an organization, we have kind of three campaigns that the last two kind of go kind of together. And these all came from campaign. The first campaign on clean air and water, that one came from us knocking on doors. COVID right now, we're having to get a little bit creative with the way that we talk to community. But prior to COVID, you would find us in bus stops, laundromats, where people go buy bottled water, people's doors, to really engage with people in conversations about the issues that they were facing. And when we started canvassing in Commerce City, the only thing that we would hear back from people is that I have a filter, I buy bottled water, I don't trust my water is safe, and why is my air always in like a bad position, right? And so we have a clean water and air campaign, and then we do a lot of work to really move us to a just and equitable transition, and then the Thrive agenda, which moves into sort of the just transition. And so in the clean air and water campaign, it's really important that we talk about environmental racism when we talk about air quality. Because yes, Colorado as a state, there's 2.5 million people in our community that that live in counties that have failing grades for air quality, right? And bad ozone days. We also have a bunch of people that at least have an entire month in a year with bad air quality days. But there's also a component that's happening in our state and across the country that means that there's certain communities that have an extra layer of burden when it comes to environmental hazards and both air contaminants and chemicals that are in the air, as well as water contaminants. And so there's three corporate polluters, like we like to call them, right, that are all surrounding a community. And these are just the three major ones. We all know that there's two other corporations that are asphalt facilities that are also emitting some of these chemicals in our community. And so Suncor, which is the refinery in Commerce City, Phillips 66 Terminal, who's also in Commerce City, and Sinclair Terminal, who is in Henderson, Colorado, which is just literally north of Commerce City. It's in Adams County. So they're all kind of surrounding North Denver and Commerce City. And let's remember that El Área Swansea is home to the most polluted zip code, not just in Colorado, but in the entire country. And there's a specific reason for this, right? They're producing benzene, they're producing hydrogen cyanide and hydrogen sulfide, and all of these dangerous chemicals are ending up in our air. Suncor is also known as a corporation that has this outburst, and last year people woke up to ash falling from the sky. And what did Suncor as a corporation do? Offer free car washes, right? A complete slap in the face to our community that are suffering from asthma, other health impacts and everything else. And we all know that this issues that people are having because of air quality issues are leading to people being having worse cases of COVID or being more susceptible to having COVID cases right now. And so for us, it's about talking about that. It's not by coincidence, right, that all these corporations are in this area. This area is mostly low income and mostly communities of color. A lot of monolingual Spanish speakers live there. We're not seeing this in more affluent white communities, right? Like literally Commerce City and North Denver have become the dumping ground from the state. And like we have not done enough to actually fight for these communities that are being directly impacted by corporate polluters. And then water contamination as well, right? In 2018, there was a report that came out that said that 12 of the wells that distribute water to 50,000 homes in Commerce City have PFAS contaminants in them. Just recently, like literally 2 weeks ago, the city of Commerce City filed a lawsuit against Suncor because they have been putting PFAS contaminants in the waterways, right? And so again, corporate accountability and really holding these corporate polluters accountable for the damage that they're causing in our community. And so that's just a huge focus for us to really talk about sort of the everyday struggles that our people are facing that are not so much like climate change, fires, and everything else, which is all important, but really how do we talk about the everyday kind of experience that people are facing based on the zip code that they live on, right? Because the zip code where you live shouldn't determine the type of quality of water that you have and the type of air that you get to breathe in your house. And then on the just and equitable transition, I know that last year, right, in this event, you all heard about HB 1913-14, how proud our state is that Colorado became the first state to establish an Office of Just Transition from Coal. And so today I'm really, really excited to tell you all the organizing story behind this. Because let's be real, it's not like our elected officials, as much as I appreciate some of them, right? Some of them don't wake up with the best intentions every day, right? They have to be pushed to do the right thing. And I've learned this in my long history of like many years in organizing, right? Like a lot of those folks don't wake up with like, let's do this. Let's try to how to figure it out, right? And HB 1913-14, that was the case. We partnered with the Colorado AFL-CIO, which is a union, has a lot of folks that are in trade unions that are impacted and will be impacted from a transition from coal, right? And we started talking about what is the thing that we need to do to really push the state to think about if we're going to move to a just transition, right, and move us to a renewable energy economy, how do we not make the biggest mistake that we could ever make to transition and leave workers that are impacted and communities that are disproportionately impacted behind? And so the whole intention of this bill was to move the state to really think about how do we actually put workers that are first and disproportionately impacted first, right? Disproportionately impacted communities first. And so that was sort of like the goal on this. And let me just tell you, I'm sorry, but not everyone was excited about it, right? There had to be a lot of pulling and pushing to get people to get excited about this and to get them to support it. And now we're glad that we're moving forward with it. I think some of the things also, I know the link has been put to the plan and everything else as I'm on the advisory committee for it, but also I'm the chair of the disproportionately impacted communities committee for it, that we have a great plan, right? But COVID happened. And COVID happened, and that meant that there's certain things that we can't move at the legislature because of the budget, but there's also a big question for Colorado, right? When it comes to just transition about where is that money gonna come from and how are we gonna pay for the transition? And how are we gonna pay for a transition from coal, but also other fossil fuels in the state? And so I think that that's also a mechanism that we have to be really clear about, right? Especially with a state that has something like Tabor, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, that actually has a lot of restrictions on where we can pull money from, right? Especially when it comes to taxes, about how do we actually move this work forward and how do we actually have the money to pay for this vision to really move us to a renewable energy economy that lifts up workers and lifts us communities of color and communities that are disproportionately impacted. And then on the Thrive Act, which is something that I think you all might have heard as the Thrive agenda, this is something that I also think could really transform the way that we're thinking about just transition at the national scale, right? And this might not be the particular bill that gets passed in Congress, but it's definitely pushing conversations. And so the Thrive Act is something that comes from the Green New Deal network. I'm pretty sure you all have heard about the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is not a policy per se, right? The Green New Deal is more of like the sort of like the vision of how do we actually move an agenda forward to address the climate crisis, but address it in a different way. Address it by prioritizing green jobs, address it by prioritizing workers and by prioritizing communities of color. And so the Thrive Act is a piece of legislation that's going to be introduced both in the Senate, in Congress, and in the House in the middle of April. And this will move us to 100% clean energy by 2035. It'll have guaranteed wage benefit replacement for workers that will be displaced from this transition. It will put 40% of green investment and benefits in disproportionately impacted communities, right? So again, really what the focus of like, if we transition, how do we make sure that we prioritize workers that are going to be displaced and we create green jobs, not just that like are going to pay you minimum wage, but green jobs that are actually going to provide you with benefits, with that are going to be good paying, and that you will be able to unionize if that's what you desire, right? Like that are union paying jobs. And then also putting investment in communities. Like I said, Commerce City and North Denver are a huge example of communities that have been disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards and by a lack of the addressing what's happening in this community. So how do we invest in these communities to really support them so people don't have to spend money on bottled water when they're in Commerce City, but that's not the case in Highlands Ranch, right? How do we make sure that we do this? And then really thinking about investment in public health and schools and care work and postal service, because those are all green jobs, right? Like how do we actually move and really do that? And then investment in clean water infrastructure, safe buildings and all that stuff. And so this sort of the Thrive Act is going to be introduced, and there's going to be a lot of money to invest in cities and states. And we hope that this could really like drive a conversation in DC about the urgency, right, to act on climate and to move us to a transition to a renewable energy economy, while not forgetting that we can't just think about a transition without thinking about the folks that are most directly impacted in order for us to do it the right way and something that's going to help us all. So I'll stop there, but if folks have questions, I have my information up on the slide. Feel free to reach out. If you folks want to get involved in our work on either we have an air toxics bill right now that is going through the House in Colorado to address some of the stuff that this corporate polluters are doing. Feel free to reach out so we can plug you into that work, as well as the national work for the Thrive Act or anything else.
Amazing, amazing, so inspiring. I am now looking towards the chat. If we have questions from the audience, I recognize quite a few names in the audience. We have high quality, everyone from lobbyists to other academics to organizers. So feel welcome to put your questions in and direct them towards us. I will ask one to get us started, and that is, Lizeth, bringing up Tabor made me think about this, then the specifics of Colorado, and since we have such great expertise here, could all of you maybe name something in the past year that has made you, maybe you could expand on, you had limited time, you could expand on a point you've already made, what the challenges are in Colorado before we move to more solutions. Tabor is definitely one of them, and the distribution of money and how we can use it for communities, as is racism and white supremacy. Do others want to elaborate on any challenges that you think we should be thinking about moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give one from sort of like an organizing perspective, right? And really trying to lift up the voices of people who are directly impacted, not just to share their stories, but also lead on the planning and development of the policy changes that we could move forward. And I think that this has always been a challenge, but I think particularly last year as COVID happened, we saw it a lot more. And that is that sometimes even though, you know, you're sick and you're experiencing all of these things because Suncor is right on your backyard, people have to kind of prioritize the worries that they have to have for that day and that week, right? And so last year, as we were engaging some folks were kind of like, I lost my job because of COVID. And so I need to worry about how am I going to pay my rent at the end of the month. And I cannot talk to you about Suncor right now. I cannot talk to you about air toxics or water quality because I'm literally not going to be able to stay here at the end of the month, or, you know, like being sick from COVID or anything else. And so I think that that's always an issue that we find when we're trying to organize the people that are like the most impacted, right? Because they're facing so many other issues to worry about. And so I do think that as an organization, we had to pivot to both kind of address the immediate need from community, even though we're not providing services, and then try to still move people into a conversation about how do you feel about what's happening in your community and how we can take action together, right? And so I would say that's also sort of like a challenge that comes from more like a grassroots organizing perspective of like our organization trying to organize community, that like I think, you know, the impacts of COVID are going to be felt long after we get back to semi-normal this year, right? And what does that mean for us to continue to organize with those communities that are going to feel the impact of COVID long after, right? Like the economic, financial impact is going to stay with them. And so I would just lift that up in sort of the really bringing in impacted folks into the work.
Well said. Does anyone else want to comment on other challenges you see before we switch to others? You don't have to. Oh, Will, go ahead and then Steph.
So one thing that I think is a significant challenge is really the question of how we can move towards market transformation in arenas where the changes really involve millions of people. So there's sort of a regulatory framework that I think is driving change with electric utilities and driving change in the oil and gas sector, certainly more to do when it comes to other industrial operators, but there's sort of a framework where there's a relatively small number of responsible entities that you can essentially require change to happen. But sort of the fact that transportation is our largest source of emissions now, buildings is one of our 4 largest sources, and the question of particularly in a state that has Tabor, where we are in many ways more restricted than other states in our ability to do large-scale public investment to support those changes. I think there's a lot of need for us to be very creative in, you know, what are the policy frameworks we can put in place to help create widespread, you know, retrofitting of building, widespread changes to the both travel patterns and the vehicles that people choose in order to sort of drive sort of the big emission reductions that we're going to need from those really big sectors.
I would just love to add to what both panelists have already said. I think that I do a lot of community-based research in oil and gas impacted communities where there's a lot of hydraulic fracturing and other phases of unconventional oil and gas production going on. And I see such a similar thing, right? Where you have people who are either employed by the industry or who feel like their neighbors are employed by the industry. And so they're very hesitant to critique or to get involved in any kind of action within their neighborhoods, even if they have well pads 1,000 feet from the side of their home, right? So there's this kind of environmental blackmail that goes on and runs deep, I think, in many of these most impacted spaces, because there's such a perception of needing to align with those industries, but also because we lack safety nets in this nation, right? People rely so much on employment or the promise of employment, even if it's not there. that I think that has a real power to keeping people from mobilizing and from demanding and building something better, right? Because we're kind of all beholden to the system that we depend upon, perceived or otherwise, right? And along with Tabor, I think it's another side of that, right? Is really reduced budgets that state agencies have to enforce regulations. And so even though states are required to enforce more and more regulations as the federal government kind of washes its hands of that, especially since the 1980s and 90s, you see that there's more and more reliance on corporate self-regulation because of that, right? So that's how we can get into a situation where, you know, a facility like the Suncor refinery can pollute like it has, and we don't necessarily have the teeth in terms of our state agencies to regulate that kind of behavior. And I think those are two limitations really related to neoliberal policy measures of deregulation and shrinking state provided social safety nets over the last few decades.
We have a very specific answer in the Q&A, and I'm going to read it because I don't think everyone can see it, but somebody, and I don't, so everyone doesn't have to answer every question, but somebody asked specifically about the role of recycling and composting in the just transition. I think they have a particular interest in streams of collection for e-waste. Maybe this is related to electronic, you know, e-car infrastructure and all the technology conversation. Has there been, I know in Boulder, our former mayor ran a waste facility, so we maybe talk about it more than other places, but I don't know of anything. So do any of you, Will, do you have a take on, is composting or recycling part of the story of thinking about these technologies? And if not, is it because it doesn't have the carbon footprint of the other industries you're talking about?
No, I think it is part of the story. And certainly when, you know, from an emissions standpoint, you know, methane emissions are a really significant part of the story. They're not as long lived as carbon dioxide, and the concentrations are much lower, but they're much more intense GHG in terms of their radiative forcing. And while, you know, our largest sources or the largest reductions that we see in methane emissions, I think, are going to come from reducing methane emissions from coal mines and from the oil and gas industry. I think there's big opportunities also that are associated with things like food waste. And, you know, one way that you can approach that is through methane recovery from landfills, but a better approach, to the extent that you're able to do it, is to divert that food waste up front and compost it. There was legislation, it was either last year or the year before, to create the Front Range Waste Diversion Enterprise. And it's in sort of the early sort of startup phase of actually starting to provide funding to expand waste diversion efforts in the Front Range. And I do think it's not like the big piece of the emissions, but I think it's an important element.
Thank you. That was a great answer. We have a follow-up one on donut economics, Stephanie, but Lizeth might also want to end up responding. So part of donut economics, the reason why donut is chosen as the metaphor is that it's not just about survival. It's something about thriving. Lizeth brought up the specific, you know, Thrive Act, Thrive agenda coming out of the Green New Deal Coalition. Could you say more about, I think the question's really about, in addition to the number crunching and the counting of emissions, which is incredibly important, there's a huge cultural shift some of us are advocating for. And so could you say something more about why donut, Stephanie specifically, and then maybe, you know, what that means for Colorado? And then Lizeth, if you had anything for us on, I saw you had listed Indigenous healing, or I know you work with multiple communities that might give us insight into some of the solutions of how to think beyond just trying to survive.
Lizeth, feel free to go first if you'd like.
I mean, I can address sort of the last part, the last component first. I mean, I will think that the reason why I decided to talk about air toxics and water quality is because to us, that's really critical. And when we think about just transition, we feel like I've been in so many different workshops, presentations, conversations where just transition gets put into like this big policy buckets, right? And then money for water infrastructure, right? But the reality is that there's so many different components that disproportionately impacted communities are facing that are beyond sort of this climate crisis conversations that we hear on TV, right? Like the reality is that people walk outside in their backyard and their air is horrible and people have asthma, their kids have asthma. And a lot of the times when you talk with those communities, they're like, oh, it's been like that since I've been here and I've been here for 20 years, right? It's like become normalized for people to say, you know, when we talk to folks about water, they say, oh, well, we've been buying bottled water forever. So like, that's normal. And I'm like, no, that's not supposed to be normal. You shouldn't have to pay to put filters in your home or buy bottled water. That is not a thing. You should have access to clean, safe drinking water, right? And so I think it's also important to know that like a lot of these components when it comes to the just transition, sometimes in the bigger political spaces get lost, and it's important for us to bring them back on and really, really focus on them, right? And then I think when it comes to solutions, I think that that's what we heard at the doors from people, right? Like we literally were trying to talk to people about just transition and people were like, my water, the air, what are we gonna do about Suncor? Because everyone says they're gonna do something about Suncor, but no one ends up doing anything, right? The community knows Suncor is like, gets a slap in the hand, move on, you violated another permit, we'll move on, you know, whatever. And so people know that. And so it's sort of like, what's gonna change, right? And so I think that it's focusing sort of on the everyday life of folks, right? But I would also say that in the Thrive conversation, and that's why it's called a Thrive Act, and that's why it includes all of those components. It's because also it's addressing what certain communities have been facing for many, many years in this country, whereas other communities have not had to face that, right? And their color, their background, the zip code where they live, and their income has been the components of why they're facing extra sort of burdens when it comes to environmental hazards, right? And so the Thrive sort of component is like, we can't just pretend that we're on an equal setting, right? And that we're just gonna move and transform. We actually have to go back and address what people have been sort of facing for many, many years. And it's also about like, how do we create a green economy that works for all of us? Like, and not just a green economy that's going to work for the big corporations that are going to have the solar panels and windmills and all that stuff, right? Like, but an economy that actually works for the workers, right? So the worker that's transferring from a cold job, that's a 4-figure job, doesn't end up transferring to a job that's going to pay him $30,000 a year. And he's not going to be able to retire. He's going to have to continue to work, right? How do we look at all of those components to really think about, when we think about just transition, we're thinking about addressing the climate crisis, addressing the disproportionate impacts that our communities have faced for so long, but also making sure that we move into an economy where people have the opportunity to have a job and get decent wages and have representation, right? Without having this sort of like, well, I don't know if I'm going to buy dinner this week because I barely was able to pay rent, right? That's sort of the Thrive component of really looking at sort of this transition in a really different way that's going to transform our economy for years to come.
Yeah, and just to, thank you, Lizeth, just to address the donut part of that question, why donut in terms of why I would use that, right, as a good example. First of all, I think it's incredibly visual and it's powerful in that it's visualizing what a discipline like environmental sociology that I work within has done for decades and has not so successfully visualized or given a graphic image to. So I think it really translates across all different scales, and you know, cities, communities, neighborhoods, and nations can really identify with it and can use it in really creative and malleable ways, right? And I think that's really appealing. But really, it comes from a place of me being a teacher, right? And teaching students about environmental injustice and environmental racism and bringing in all of these experiences from working in communities that have been sacrifice zones, from uranium to oil and gas to coal, and just seeing them get weighed down by it. And by the end of the semester, just kind of over and over again, right? What can we do? And in terms of this conversation, right, I think we all might feel like the urgency is so great, and what can we possibly do? And what I like about this is that it gives us a very concrete engaging model for how to build something better. And so instead of just, we have to focus on what's wrong, and we have to critique the power structures and the historical structures that have gotten us to this place. But I think it really helps to visualize and to think about, well, what does an alternative look like? And not just an alternative, but what do a bunch of alternatives look like that fit within that general model? So I think it's incredibly generative, and it really kind of sparks hope in a way that I find really fun to teach and really important for people right now.
Thank you for that answer. I'm copying now the questions are coming fast and furious into the chat. So I'm going to read two of them to give you some time. They're also in the chat. So one of the questions is centered around emissions and food systems. So if anyone wanted to also follow up on do our emissions graphs and figures taking into consideration the food we import and environmental injustices towards environmentalists and workers, or towards the environment probably, and workers associated with that food, wondering how movement towards local food systems, for example, can move us towards a just transition in Colorado. This might have been because someone asked the other question about the donut. The other one, more specifically towards Will, what's your take on the SB 200 legislation just introduced by Representative Jackson and Senator Winter to embed in law some of the aspirations the governor spoke about? The senator and representative both stated Colorado is still far off track from meeting our 2025-2030 targets. And the third question I was sent was about infrastructure, which the governor also brought up at the beginning as a possibility. So I think I'm going to start with Will because he was named by one of our esteemed audience members who I've been to panels where she has spoken, and then see if anyone else wants to jump in on his response and or on the food question. So Will?
Yeah, happy to speak to SB 200. You know, I would start by saying that I actually disagree with the characterization that we're far off track on meeting the 2025 and 2030 targets. The whole point of the GHG roadmap was essentially mapping out what are the steps that we need to take above and beyond what we're already doing in order to achieve those targets. And there's a near-term action plan with a lot of specificity in it about what we'll be doing in 2021 and 2022 by venue at the legislature, at the Air Quality Control Commission, at the Public Utilities Commission to achieve those targets. If we actually are able to sort of move forward and implement the things that are in that near-term action plan, we believe that that will allow us to move towards those 2025 and 2030 targets. Senate Bill 200, you know, the administration is not supportive of the way that SB 200 is structured. I would say it delegates essentially all of the authority in each sector to the Air Quality Control Commission to take a regulatory approach. And we're taking an all of government approach. We think that while regulation has a very important role to play, and sort of the Air Quality Control Commission has played, I think, crucial role in the decarbonization approach we have in the electric sector and in oil and gas, and will play a very important role in industrial rulemaking later this summer, as well as additional transportation rulemakings. If you're going to make changes in our largest sectors like transportation, you really need market transformation and investment. You can't do it through a purely regulatory approach that we think could actually impose some very large costs on Coloradans.
Did Lizeth or Stephanie want to respond on food systems or on infrastructure, or follow up on Will's point? We don't all always have to agree. I think last year I got into it on fracking with someone, so that's okay too.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, as an organization, we haven't yet taken a position on SB 200. We've been focused on our air toxics bill to just require data from this corporate polluters. I will say, though, that I think that, you know, the governor also mentioned sort of the equity group, right, that came together to really talk about how do we actually move equity on all of this? And I was part of that group, and sorry, my dogs get excited when I'm doing these conversations and they just want to be part of them. So if you see them on the background. And I think I would say that, like, I think I'm going to go in a different direction to say that like sometimes putting everything on the Air Quality Control Commission is a concern for us, because the Air Quality and Control Commission is not one that we elect. It's not one that it's easy for us to hold accountable. And so when this bill was first moved forward last time, right, that started the sort of the plan, our push was like, how do we actually get more direction from state elected officials who ultimately are the people that our community elected to be in office to address these issues? And if you put it on a commission that is inaccessible to our community, right, that a lot of the times when we go testify, it's like a freaking check mark. Oh, good, we heard from some community, let's move on. And then it's completely ignored. What is the actual power that we have later when it's on the commission's hand to really transform what this plan is going to look like, if these are not people that then we can go hold accountable as elected officials? And so we have not taken a position on it, but I would say that like we do have concerns with everything just being put on commissions and not really asking of our elected officials to take. We understand sometimes there needs to be rulemaking and all of those things, but sometimes our elected officials could actually give more guidance, right, and be more precise on where we need to go. And I know that when the bill was first moved forward, you know, we had to work with the groups that were moving it to really ensure that this equity component was there and that it wasn't just a blanket move something forward, but no, you have to do extra work to ensure that disproportionately impacted communities' voices are included, because we know that if it's not included in the bill, it's not going to happen, right? Because the commissioners don't all the time actually have representation from communities that are disproportionately impacted. So I'll just add that as another extra component for folks to think about.
Stephanie, do you wish to add anything? If not, I think we're getting close to the end of time. I'll note one of our local folks who knows a lot more about waste recycling than me, Haley Cunningham, put in answers on the earlier question on recycling with details on the bill. So people can read that if they were interested in that expansion. But since we're running out of time, if anyone would have one other comment you want to add, hope particularly maybe directed towards students. I think Lizeth, you were generous at the end and calling people in towards work they could do. Will, I don't know if students are interested in policy. If you have advice for them, you certainly know what it's like to work with students and work in the Capitol. And Stephanie, obviously this is your wheelhouse. So if you could maybe address students as a closing comment in relationship to whatever else you'd want to say, we'd appreciate it.
Well, one thing I would just like to leave us with is the idea that kind of like what I was saying before, right? These problems can seem really daunting, I think, especially to people who are high school, college age or younger. And I think that it's been so inspirational and amazing that our youth movement has been one of the most energized parts of environmental justice movements, but especially climate justice recently. And so I would say just keeping hope and really knowing that you can lead this movement, I think is, and at all levels, right, is so key. And if you know, if I can do anything to help, or the Center for Environmental Justice, or I think any of us, we're here to be allies and accomplices in that, because it can feel really heavy, but I think we're in a 8 or 10 year span of time where keeping hopeful and energized is vital.
Maybe Will, and then we'll end with Lizeth, and then Max is coming back.
You know, I think I would just note that I very much agree with Lizeth's comment that even when you have great elected officials, that you need to have community organizing in order to actually move things forward, that there are so many different forces at play that even very well-meaning elected officials are not necessarily going to sort of move that social and environmental justice and climate action agenda forward without the, you know, the people out there pushing and supporting them on that. And I think that there's an enormously important role for students in the movements that make all of this possible.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, you're never too young to get involved. You're never too unexperienced, right? I got my start when I was in high school. I didn't even speak English then, you know, and I was already trying to figure out what trouble I was gonna make in the world and in my school. And then when I was in college, I found community organizing, right? And fell in love with really working with directly impacted folks to move stuff forward. I didn't know what policy was. I didn't know how the Capitol worked. I didn't know any of it, but you don't have to know it, right? Like you can join a group, get involved with others, and what you know, someone will ever know. I always tell our folks, you're never just a teacher, right? You're in every situation, you're the teacher and the student, because you all have something to give and something to receive all the time. So look at it from that perspective. And then we need y'all, like, even if you're like, hey, like, we want to do some work in Boulder, like pick up the phone, call the governor, call your elected officials. We're gonna have to move at the federal level. Our senators, Senator Hickenlooper, right? And I'm laughing, and hopefully folks know why, because it's gonna be hard on this issue. And then Senator Bennett, right? And pick up the phone and call them, write them letters, visit their office, like anything you can do to like really move them, to bring the urgency, right, that you feel about this issue to them. And then there's other organizations, it's not just us. We'd love for folks to get plugged in with us, but like search other organizations that are doing work on environmental and climate justice and get involved with them. I'm pretty sure there's one that is really focused in Boulder. We're more focused on the other areas that you could plug in. And again, like, you don't have to know it all, right? Like whatever you bring in your passion, that's like ingredient number one. Your passion is the one thing that you need in order to get started and really figure out like, how do you actually move forward, work to create positive change in the community.
Thank you so much. I believe Max is coming back in now. And Stephanie, Lizeth, anyone who wants to put links into the chat to remind people again, they're probably buried in there for follow-up actions or events, please feel welcome to do so. Max?
Thank you very much, Phaedra, for facilitating a great conversation. Thank you so much, Stephanie MALIN. Thank you, Will TOOR, and thank you, Lizeth CHACON, for your great prepared remarks and for this wonderful discussion. It's been really inspiring. We unfortunately, though, need to conclude our session today. The good news is we're recording this. We're going to post it so that others can watch who weren't able to join us today live. But in conclusion, I just want to thank co-organizers, Professor Phaedra Pezzullo, students Andrew Benham and Presley Church for their great work to make this gathering possible. And thank you to those over at Solve Climate by 2030, even Goodstein and colleagues, for also bringing this in as part of a larger global effort. So thank you all very much. I turn it over to Presley Church to close things out.
Thanks, Max. Thank you all for joining us today. This, as Max said, this event will be recorded and it will be soon available on the Solve Climate by 2030 YouTube account. I just put the link in the chat to that. Creating a just and green future for Colorado and our country requires all of us. I want to hit on the point that Stephanie said, that just to keep hope, and Max has a phrase, up with hope, that we've adopted here at Inside the Greenhouse, and you'll notice that was our hashtag today, so keep that in mind. And if you want to get involved with Solve Climate by 2030's initiative to make climate a class, you can visit solveclimateby2030.org and follow them on all social media platforms. I also put the link in the chat for that. You can follow Inside the Greenhouse on Twitter at ITG_Boulder and on Instagram at everydayclimate. We do have another opportunity coming up that is a comedy for climate change event on April 22nd, this Earth Month. That link is also in the chat, so that will be a great event on how to bring creative climate communication into your everyday life. Have a great rest of your evening, and I can't wait to see how we all shape the future of Colorado.
Thank you to our amazing panelists.
Thank you very much.
Adios.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Great job, Presley.
Thank you. You
Right.
too.
Yeah, it was great. Well done. I'll see you soon. And you've got the recording, yeah?
Yep. All right.
Awesome.
Ending now. Thanks, everyone.